No, I fully agree with you. I mean, you need an inner conviction. You see, there is both the objective as well as the subjective aspect of Christian faith. You know, sometimes we in the apologetics work try to emphasize the objective to such an extent as if the subjective is not at all required. I think the Bible puts it very clearly, and the work of the Holy Spirit in bringing conviction to the individual, and even what we call general revelation, is an act of God the Spirit, and I need to relate to it at some point. But the mystery is how a human being interacts with God. To me, that's been a fascination.
Now, let's get personal here for a minute.
Yes.
I'm 62 years of age. When I was 5,
Yes.
without looking for it, without wanting it, without expecting it, I had an encounter with the Lord. Not on my initiative, but obviously on His. And it was so profound, so overwhelmingly moving, that as I look back on my life, I say that was the defining moment of my life to this day. Now, my mom had taught me to read when I was 4, so I could read. I don't know how much I was reading of the Bible, but you know, I didn't have a great sense of guilt. I hadn't been sleeping around. I wasn't a drunk. I wasn't a drug addict. I didn't have any sense of having to get away from my horrible life. My dad was a pastor, and I was surrounded by pastors. My whole family are pastors and evangelists and missionaries. But I had this profound sense that I was a sinner and that I needed to commit my life to Jesus. And that whole experience, which happened on a hot summer Saskatchewan afternoon, I'll never, ever forget. But here's the point. Not only did the Lord reveal His love to me and my need for repentance and for committing my life to Him, but from that moment, LT, I had a sense of love for the Lord. Now, I didn't know Him. I loved Him before I knew Him. Just like I loved my mom and dad before I knew them. You know, my whole life has been an adventure of getting to know my mom and dad. They're still alive and doing great. And I know them better now than I've ever known in my life. But I loved before I knew, and that's my point that I'm trying to get at here. And I'm interested in your comment. This is where revelation comes in.
Absolutely.
And this is where, if you will, the supra-rational element enters in. Because you're right, apologetics is quite a rational process, quite objective, but it's not enough.
No.
There has to be that personal sense of being loved by the Almighty.
Right.
Which is a revelatory thing, right?
Absolutely. I mean, no doubt over that.
Now, what about you? Did this happen to you? I mean, how is it that you are the kind of, committed believer you are today?
Well, I can probably go back to a time when I was 6 years old, when I did have this amazing revelation from God. But I would not say that that was really the turning point in my life. I think it really happened several years later when I was in the university, finishing my engineering degree, when I really came into an encounter with Christ. But I was brought up in an Anglican home, reasonably religious. But surely I can say that the first step is always with God. I cannot just bypass that reality.
How does the revelation of the love of God for us translate in terms of our love for our fellow man? Our love for the Muslim, our love for the Hindu, our love for the whatever, the secular, the atheist, the agnostic. How does that happen, and how can that love be a genuine love when the other side are vilifying us, accusing us of having a hidden agenda, and wanting nothing to do with us?
Oh my, this is a big question as well. You know, when Jesus is asked about the greatest commandment, He gives 2 instead of 1. And I've often thought that that particular lawyer was not so smart. He should have stayed on and asked a supplementary question. He should have said, which is the greater of the 2?
Right.
And I think Jesus would have probably answered that question in this way. He would have said, the first commandment is first, because without truly loving God selflessly, you cannot truly love others. But this is where, Jim, I would like to make a comment, because today when I see so much of Christian programs, our love for God is seen purely as a religious exhibitionism. I mean, whether it's I preach a sermon or something like that. That cannot be truly an expression of the love of God. Ultimately, only 2 people know who loves God, God and that person. But if I truly love God, I will have to love my neighbor. So if we had put that supplementary question to Jesus, he would have answered that question by saying, the first commandment is first, because without obeying the first, you cannot obey the second. But the second commandment is equal to the first, because obedience to the second commandment is the evidence that you have obeyed the first. I think, which is where I think when our detractors accuse us of a hidden agenda, what we need to do is to step back and do some self-examination. Whether our friendship with other people, in fact, just yesterday, my wife was telling one of our friends in a casual conversation that if I looked at a Muslim or a Hindu or a Jew, an atheist, as purely as a potential convert to the Christian faith, and not as a human being in her or his own right, who needs to be loved, I think we do have a hidden agenda.
Yeah, I agree.
I believe so. See, if you read the Gospels, Jesus never made his healing of the sick conditional on their following him. Oh, and they did follow him. He was absolutely thrilled. But I think that is where we need to have real selfless expression.
Well, he healed 10 lepers.
And only one came back.
And one guy comes back and thanks him, and I assume became a follower. Jesus didn't vilify the other 9.
No.
Because we're free moral agents, right?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Let's talk about India for a few minutes.
Yes.
I'm fascinated with India. I've been there recently. I'm concerned about what I'm seeing there vis-a-vis the HIV and AIDS situation. I was there during the height of it was called persecution by the state press, persecution of Christians. There was embarrassment on the part of the secular press, especially about this. But one of the sociologists who was interviewed on state television that I watched about this said the reason the radical Hindu is concerned about Christianity is that Christianity is growing at such a rate that by the year 2050, if the current rate continues, potentially 40 to 50% of India could be Christian. Now, this is what I heard when I was there.
Oh.
I'm thinking, what?
Yeah.
What? Surely this guy is overstating it. And I don't want to get into that.
Yeah.
But my question about India is this. It is a force. Its population is about equivalent to that of China. Mm-hmm. In many ways, it's becoming a high-tech giant. In other ways, the poverty there is universal. So that you really have this kind of dynamic tension between the first world momentum and the third world reality. How would you approach India if you had the opportunity with the gospel of Jesus Christ? What would you emphasize first? And what would be the essential substance of your message to India?
I think one of the things that probably triggers this reaction from high caste Hindus is the view that the Christian faith would destroy Indian culture. I do not know, in your many visits to India you have heard this.
No.
And I think the Christian church has not really articulated an answer to that question. And I'm going to give you an example from one of my visits to India recently. It was a very small meal together with some Muslim students. It was not a preachy evangelistic meeting. We were 4 Christians, there were 11 Muslims, 9 Iranian and 2 Afghan students. And as we were having the meal, one of the Muslim students spoke up, an Iranian student. He said, my language is Farsi, we are from the Persian culture. Our culture is an ancient culture. Why should I worship Allah only in Arabic? And I told him this. I said, you must know that Islam is a culturally homogenizing faith. You may be a Farsi-speaking Persian, Iranian, very proud of your culture. But once you have chosen to be a Muslim, you have to submit yourself to this cultural hegemony. I'm a Tamil, I'm a Christian. If I become a Muslim, I'll be culturally Arabized. But if you come to Christ, you can bring your culture with you. You can bring your language with you. And you can worship the unique Jesus in any way which is culturally appropriate to you. And that became a starting point of a conversation. And I think that is what we need to do in India. Now, we have the contextualization idea. I have very good friends on the contextualization side, but I ask them not to use that word because it sounds a bit manipulative.
Yeah.
That we should rather say culturally redemptive presentation of the gospel. Because when I read the closing chapters of the Bible, Revelation 21, where the glory of the nations will be part of the New Jerusalem, the church. The kings of the earth will bring their honor into the New Jerusalem, which means that the understanding of the gospel, Jim, basically I feel we have misunderstood the gospel or overemphasized the personal aspect of salvation rather than the cosmic aspect of salvation, that God is in the job of redeeming his creation, because the Bible ends with the new heavens and a new earth. The church comes down out of heaven from God, which means that the composition of the redeemed creation, every culture will be brought for the worship of Jesus. If only we would make that as part of the preaching of the Christian gospel, which you do not find in any other religion. Let me tell you, we started this whole conversation with the world religions. If you take Hinduism or Islam, they have no such answer as what we can give as representatives of Christ.
About 2 minutes left. Is Western Christianity essentially materialistic?
Well, I would say yes and no. Let me say something. I've written a short piece on materialism versus materiality.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, materiality is the affirmation of the reality of the material world. I think as Christians we should reject materialism, but we must affirm materiality. Now, the moment you only talk about materialism, you have this huge swing in the West to Eastern religions and the New Age, which rejects the reality of the material world, calls this whole thing as illusion. Whereas that's not the biblical narrative. So I think what we ought to be saying, whether it's from the Western perspective or from my perspective as an Eastern Indian, Singaporean, whatever you may call me, is to begin to see that the Bible affirms the reality of the material world. God creates this world. And the Bible ends with the redemption, the renewal of material creation. But when you pursue material gains without reference to any transcendent frame of reference, you end up as a materialist. Right. Whereas we need to bring together materiality and spirituality, not one at the expense of the other.
Yeah, not fall into the Gnostic heresy.
Absolutely, absolutely.
LT Jeyachandran has been my guest. We could go on for hours.
Yes.
You must come back sometime. Thanks for coming our way.
Yeah. Thank you, Jim.